Why was she the only one still awake in the barracks that night? The hum of distant generators rattled faintly through the floorboards, and the pale glow of a single desk lamp washed her tired face in amber light. Her uniform jacket lay draped over the chair, sleeves rolled, patches worn, fabric stiff with dust from the day's patrol. She stared at the photograph tucked into the corner of her mirror, a little boy's smile, missing front teeth, frozen in time. Her son. She whispered his name under her breath like a prayer. Nobody here knew, or maybe they did, but they never asked. To them, she was just another body in uniform, another soldier ready to carry out orders. But to her, every mission was a weight balanced on two fragile pillars: duty to her country, and the unspoken duty to a child she hadn't held in over a year. Outside, a storm was brewing. The wind slammed against the barracks, rattling shutters. She could feel it inside her chest too. Something was coming, and it wasn't just the weather. They didn't call her name during the briefing. Not at first. She sat at the edge of the table, listening as commanders rattled off assignments: reconnaissance, overwatch, convoy security. One by one, names were pinned to missions. Her eyes flicked across the room. Men nodded at one another, trading quiet jokes, scribbling notes. Nobody looked her way. Until the major cleared his throat. "We need a sniper positioned here," he said, stabbing a red mark onto the map. "High ridge overlooking the valley. Risk is heavy. If they push through here, we won't hold the line." Silence, no volunteers. Then a pause. His eyes found hers, a beat too long. "Sergeant Vale," he said. Her stomach tightened. She didn't flinch, didn't let the ripple of unease show. She simply nodded, voice steady. "Yes, sir." But there was something she hadn't told them. Not yet. The ridge wasn't just another piece of ground to her. She knew that place. Years ago, before war carved scars across this landscape, she had walked that valley with her father. He had called it beautiful, the way the grass bent in unison with the wind, the way the earth stretched into forever. She hadn't been back since the day they buried him, wrapped in a flag. Now she was going back with a rifle. The ridge was worse than she remembered. The climb tore at her lungs, mud slick under her boots, rocks biting into her palms when she stumbled. She didn't complain, not aloud. Only in the silence of her breath did she admit the exhaustion. She carried her pack like she carried everything else, with grace, even when it cut into her shoulders. At the top, she lay flat against the dirt, setting her rifle into position. The valley spread before her, vast and indifferent. Through the scope, she could see shadows moving, enemy patrols slipping through the tree line. She adjusted the dial, her breathing steady, trained. Yet her hands trembled when she reached into her pocket. She pulled out the folded note her son had scribbled in blue crayon. "Come home soon, Mommy." Simple, childlike, a command she couldn't obey. A voice crackled in her earpiece. "Vale status." She swallowed hard, in position, eyes on target. Her heartbeat slowed. The storm clouds gathered overhead, and below the enemy gathered too. The first shot came at dawn, not from her rifle but theirs. Mortars rained into the valley, thudding the ground, shaking the ridge under her chest. Her headset filled with chaos, men shouting, vehicles grinding into action, commanders barking orders that dissolved into static. She pressed her cheek to the stock, breath calm, finger hovering over the trigger. Through her scope, she watched them advance. Too many. She couldn't stop them all. She had to choose. Her scope locked on a man with a radio pack, shouting commands. One squeeze, one crack, and he dropped. But the guilt was instant. She had ended one life to save dozens, maybe hundreds. And still, she couldn't shake the image of his hand clutching the air as he fell. "Nice shot," came a voice in her earpiece. She didn't answer. Instead, her eyes drifted back to the valley. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Stay with me, just stay with me." She wasn't speaking to her squad. She was speaking to the boy in the photo miles away. Hours stretched into eternity. Rain lashed her face, soaking through her uniform. Her fingers grew stiff, her breath fogging against the scope. She hadn't moved in hours. And yet, she didn't allow herself to feel cold. A memory pressed in. The last time she hugged her son at the airport, he had slipped a toy soldier into her pocket. She had smiled, hiding the tears. "Keep him safe for me," he'd said, and she had promised. Now she reached into her vest and felt the tiny plastic figure. It was still there, still waiting, like him. But then the radio crackled again. "Vale, hold that ridge at all costs. Reinforcements are delayed." At all costs. She knew what that meant. She pressed her lips together, a silent vow forming. If this ridge fell, the valley fell. If the valley fell, the town beyond it would burn. And in that town, families, children, someone else's son. The storm howled. She adjusted her grip. Duty wasn't heavy. It was unbearable, yet somehow she carried it. By midnight, she wasn't alone anymore. 2 soldiers from her unit had scrambled up the ridge, faces streaked with mud, eyes wild from the fight below. They collapsed beside her, catching breath. One was young, barely 20. He fumbled with shaking hands, pulling a letter from his pocket. "If I don't make it," he whispered, "can you?" His voice broke. She put her hand on his shoulder. "You'll make it." The other, older, pulled out a photograph of a woman and a baby. He kissed it once before tucking it back. For a moment, the ridge wasn't a battlefield. It was just 3 people clinging to the memory of those waiting at home. Thunder rolled. Gunfire lit the valley. She chambered another round, eyes narrowing. The night stretched on, and she fought not just with bullets but with the weight of everyone's hopes pressing against her chest. Dawn broke again, pale and cruel. Smoke coiled upward, blotting the horizon. The valley was littered with silence, some final, some temporary. She lay still, rifle heavy, body numb. Her 2 companions were gone, carried down the ridge by medics hours before. She was alone again. She blinked against the sting of exhaustion. Every part of her wanted to collapse, but she didn't. She couldn't, because the storm hadn't passed yet. Movement caught her eye. Enemy forces regrouping, advancing again. She steadied herself, breath shallow, finger tightening. And then a pause, a strange stillness in her chest. She lowered the scope for a heartbeat, just to feel the wind across her face. It reminded her of her father's words long ago, standing in this very place. "Grace isn't about ease," he'd said. "It's about standing tall in the storm." She understood now. The battle ended without ceremony. Reinforcements finally arrived, sweeping through the valley, pushing the enemy back. Orders came through her earpiece. Mission complete, ridge secure. But she didn't feel victorious. She just felt still. As the medevac choppers roared overhead, she finally let herself sit up, stretching her stiff spine, wiping mud from her face. She reached for her pocket, pulling out the crayon note. It was smeared, edges frayed, but the words remained. "Come home soon, Mommy." She closed her eyes, holding it tight. For once, she let the tears fall, not caring who saw. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And when the storm passes, what remains isn't the noise of battle, but the quiet strength of those who carried it with grace. And so she stood, rifle slung, eyes fixed on the horizon. Silent, steady, ready to walk back down the ridge into the waiting arms of duty, sacrifice, and love. Why did the silence feel heavier than the storm itself? Sergeant Vale lay pressed against the dirt, her cheeks still numb from hours against the rifle's stock. The valley stretched wide below, wrapped in the gray hush of predawn. The only sound was the rasp of her own breath inside her headset. Yet behind that quiet she felt it, the vibration of something moving, something not yet seen. Her finger flexed along the trigger guard. Her eyes scanned through the scope, sliding past ridgelines and shadowed trees. Nothing, just wind pushing the tall grass in rippling waves. But unease is not an illusion. It's a language the body knows before the mind admits it, and her body was screaming. She exhaled slowly, steadying the tremor in her hands. She thought of her son, his crayon note tucked deep in her pocket. A child's promise of safety, written for a mother who lived among dangers he could never imagine. She whispered his name, not as comfort, but as an anchor. He was the reason she held steady when everything inside wanted to run. The radio crackled to life. "Vale, do you copy?" Her earpiece hissed, then steadied into the voice of Lieutenant Cross. Calm, clipped, a man trained to sound certain even when certainty was a lie. "Copy," she replied. "You see anything yet?" "Negative, but they're out there, waiting." A pause stretched too long, then hold position, reinforcements delayed, again. The words cut sharper than the wind. Reinforcements delayed. How many times had she heard that line? As if men and machines could be bent against the pace of war by words alone. As if a single soldier could hold back a storm by simply not moving. She adjusted her scope again. Still nothing, still everything. But she didn't tell him what she really felt, that the valley itself seemed to be holding its breath. Behind her, a scuff of boots. She turned sharply, rifle swinging half an inch before recognition stopped her. It was Corporal Hayes, mud caked up to his knees, eyes wide from the climb. "Thought you could use another set of eyes," he muttered, sliding down beside her. She didn't answer at first. She just studied him, the way his hands shook as he pulled off his gloves, the way his breathing struggled to even out. He was young, too young. She wondered if he'd ever been this close to the edge before. Finally she nodded, "Keep low." He gave a nervous laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Don't worry, I'm not trying to get famous." Famous? She almost smiled. No one up here would be remembered, not truly. Their names would blur in after-action reports, their sacrifices pressed into numbers. But she didn't tell him that. What good would it do to break him before the storm even began? The first sound came not from the valley but from the sky. A low thrum. Helicopters. No, too steady, too far. She closed her eyes, listening. Her ears caught the rhythm. Not engines, drums of artillery rolling from miles away. The offensive was coming. She shifted her rifle again, angling down toward a shadow breaking from the tree line. One figure, then another, then 10, then a column. Her jaw tightened. Through the scope, their faces blurred with distance, but their movement told the truth, calculated, precise, patient. They weren't rushing. They were unfolding like a wave gathering before it crests. She spoke into the radio, voice tight. Movement in the valley, large formation, approaching ridge sector. Static, then the lieutenant again. "Do not engage unless necessary. We need their position. Hold fire." Her finger hovered. Hold fire. She hated those words. They sounded like strategy, but really they were just gambling with time. Corporal Hayes shifted beside her, trying to peer through binoculars. His hand shook, and she placed hers over it, steadying him without looking away from the scope. "They look endless," he whispered. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Silence was enough to tell him he was right. Another memory pressed against her, the last phone call with her father before his final deployment. He had spoken in half sentences, hiding the truth even as he tried to prepare her. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't fighting," he'd said. "It's waiting to know when the fight will reach you." She had been 17 then, old enough to know what he meant, young enough to hope it wouldn't apply to her, and yet here she was, repeating his silence. The hours bled together. The enemy spread across the valley floor, shadows shifting like water. They weren't attacking yet, just testing, probing. Shots cracked from far off, but none aimed at her ridge. Not yet. Hayes muttered again, voice shaking. "What if they come straight up here? What if?" She cut him off softly. "Then we hold." "But—" Her voice hardened. "We hold." The authority in her tone surprised even her. But it steadied him, his shoulders falling as he swallowed whatever fear had been pressing through his lips. Silence again, except for the distant artillery, except for the pounding of her own heart. By late afternoon, the rain began. Thin at first, then harder, slicing sideways across the ridge, soaking through her gear. The scope blurred with drops and she wiped it clean with her sleeve. Her fingers were numb, skin raw, but she kept working. She had learned long ago that storms don't ask if you're ready. They arrive indifferent. You either break or bend. Hayes tried to light a cigarette under his poncho, but the wind laughed at him. He cursed, shoved it back into his pocket. Then, softer, as if ashamed of the thought escaping. "You ever wonder if it's worth it?" She glanced at him, rain sliding down her face. "What do you mean?" "All of this, us, them, the valley, the ridge, we kill to keep it, they kill to take it, and it just," he gestured into the mist, "never ends." She wanted to tell him no, that it was worth it, that every inch mattered, that lives depended on it. But her mouth wouldn't shape the lie. Instead, she whispered, "Sometimes, but we carry it anyway." His eyes lingered on her, searching. Then he nodded, almost grateful, not for an answer, but for honesty. By nightfall, they heard voices below, not English. The enemy was closer, too close. The sound carried up the ridge like a cruel lullaby. She lifted her rifle, scope cutting through the dark. Figures again, moving different this time, purposeful. Hayes tensed. "Are they?" "Yes," she breathed, "they're coming." The first muzzle flash lit the valley. Bullets slapped against rock, dirt spraying into her face. She pressed low, steadied her rifle, exhaled. One squeeze, a crack, a shadow dropped. Hayes fired beside her, wild at first, then tighter. The ridge echoed with thunder, their two rifles sparking defiance into the storm. For every figure that fell, two more rose, and still they held. Her radio erupted again. "Vale status." She barked over the gunfire. "Engaged, multiple hostiles advancing ridge sector, requesting support. Reinforcements still delayed." The words dissolved into static, drowned beneath the howl of the storm and the roar of her rifle. Duty wasn't heavy, it was suffocating. It pressed into her chest, filled her lungs with weight. But she carried it anyway because stopping meant surrender. She reloaded, chamber snapping forward, eyes burning against the scope. For a heartbeat, she thought of her son again, his toy soldier, his crayon words, and she whispered to herself, soft, breaking, "I'll come home, I promise." But even as she said it, she wasn't sure if she believed it. How many bullets does it take before you stop feeling them leave your rifle? Sergeant Vale asked herself that question as the ridge burned with muzzle flashes. Every squeeze of the trigger, every recoil against her shoulder, felt less like an action and more like a rhythm. The valley below was chaos, shadows moving, voices shouting in a language she didn't understand, rifles sparking back in angry response. Corporal Hayes was still beside her, teeth clenched, eyes wild in the darkness. His breathing was ragged, uneven. He wasn't trained for this kind of sustained fire, not in the open, not with the storm cutting every sound into shards. But he didn't falter. Not yet. She dropped another target, then another. Her scope found patterns where there should have been panic. She was calm, terrifyingly calm. But calm is not peace, it is survival. And beneath it, a voice whispered, "How much longer can we hold this line?" Her earpiece hissed again. "Vale status." She pressed her cheek into the mud, rifle angled steady. "Engaged, ridge holding." "Can you hold another hour?" Another hour. The question cut through her like a knife. She could almost hear the unspoken truth. Reinforcements weren't near. They were asking the impossible. Her lips moved before her mind caught up. "Copy." Hayes glanced at her, eyes wide. "Another hour." She didn't answer, because the truth wasn't something you told a soldier fighting for every breath. The truth was something you swallowed and carried until your bones cracked. The storm lashed harder, rain slicing her face like glass. The scope blurred again, but she wiped it clean, steady. She'd done this before. She could do it again. But the question inside her refused to quiet. Why was she here? Why this ridge, this mission, this burden no one else had stepped forward to take? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just orders, not just duty. It was her father's ghost, whispering from beneath the flag they'd folded and handed to her mother. It was her son's laughter and memories she replayed every night before sleep. It was the quiet pride of proving wrong every man who looked past her at the briefing table. They said duty was too heavy, but they had never carried hers. A sudden crack tore the night, not her rifle. Hayes screamed, clutching his arm as blood spattered the mud. Vale grabbed him, dragging him lower against the rocks, hands slick as she pressed against the wound. "Stay with me," she barked, voice sharper than she intended. I'm fine," he gasped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the lie. His face was pale, lips trembling. He was too young. He shouldn't have been here. She ripped a field dressing from her pouch, wrapping it tight around his arm, her fingers firm, unyielding. "You're not fine, but you're breathing. That's enough." He tried to smile, but it broke halfway. "You sound like my mom." The words hit harder than any bullet. She looked at him, really looked, saw not just a soldier but a boy who had carried someone else's hope to this ridge. And she thought of her own son, somewhere far away, waiting for a mother who might not return. Gunfire raged on. She returned to her rifle, Hayes clutching his wound beside her, teeth grinding as he fought the pain. She fired again, again. Each shot another second bought, another inch of ground held. But with every trigger pull she felt herself fraying. Not in body, her body was trained for this. In spirit. Each target that fell blurred into faceless shadows, yet each one carried the same weight. Someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother. And she was the hand that silenced them. Her father's words echoed again. "The hardest part isn't fighting, it's living with the fight after." She wondered if he had felt this same hollowing. If he, too, had pressed against the dirt, wondering if his duty made him noble, or just another cog in a cycle that swallowed men whole. "Vale," Hayes muttered, his voice faint. "Why'd you volunteer for this? The ridge, I mean." Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer at first. She just kept her scope trained, finger hovering. Finally she whispered, "Because I knew no one else would." He blinked, rain streaking his face. "That's not an answer." She almost smiled. Even bleeding, even scared, he pushed. She admired that. She adjusted her rifle, voice low. "Because this valley isn't just ground to me. My father, he used to bring me here before the war, before any of this. He said it was the most peaceful place he'd ever seen. He died in uniform. They buried him with words about honor and sacrifice. But he didn't get to keep the things he loved. This ridge, this is all I have left of him." Hayes stared at her, silence stretching. Then quietly, "So you're fighting for him?" She exhaled. "I'm fighting so maybe someone else doesn't lose what I did." A flare arced into the sky, red light staining the storm clouds. The enemy was signaling. Moments later, the valley erupted. Mortars thudded, shaking the ridge. Shrapnel sprayed dirt and stone, biting at her arms and legs. She pressed low, teeth clenched, body rattled. Hayes groaned, curling tighter around his wound. Through the chaos, she lifted her scope again. Enemy squads advancing fast, their formation spreading wide. This wasn't probing anymore. This was the push. Her chest tightened. This was it. The storm had broken. She clicked her radio. "Command, this is Vale. They're coming hard. If reinforcements don't arrive soon, we're finished." Static, then faint. "Hold, Vale, just hold." Hold, always hold. As if she were a wall that could never fall. As if duty was stronger than flesh. She fired again. Dropped 1, 2, 3. Hayes forced himself upright, gripping his rifle with his good hand, teeth bared against the pain. His shots were wild, but they were something. And still they came. Shadows climbing the valley slope, closer, closer. She could see their faces now, could hear their shouts over the storm. Her heartbeat slowed, her breathing steadied. She became the rhythm again, squeeze, crack, squeeze, crack. But inside, a different rhythm beat louder. Her son's voice, his crayon words. "Come home soon, Mommy." Would she, could she? The thought pressed harder than the recoil. The night stretched. Minutes felt like hours. Her ammunition dwindled, every reload slower, heavier. Her arms ached, her eyes burned, but she didn't stop. At last the ridge went quiet. Smoke drifted across the valley, the storm easing into a steady drizzle. She lifted her head, scanning. Bodies lay scattered below, still, unmoving. The survivors had fallen back for now. Her breath trembled, relief and dread tangled. This wasn't victory. This was only pause. She turned to Hayes. His face was pale, his eyes half-lidded, but he was alive. She touched his shoulder gently. "We made it through the night." He gave a weak laugh. "Yeah, just another hour, right?" She managed the faintest smile. For him, for herself, for the ghosts pressing around her. But even as she looked down the valley, she knew the truth. The storm wasn't over. The ridge would be tested again. And she didn't know if she had enough left to carry it. White heavy checkmark, that's part 3, written too, words packing, perfect for narration length. It deepens Vale's bond with Hayes, reveals her father's connection to the ridge, and escalates the battle tension into something heavier, moral, and deeply human. Do you want me to continue straight into part 4? Another 1550-plus words, carrying the storm forward? Or should I pause and create an image prompt for part 3, cinematic, daylight or storm-soaked close-up of Vale and Hayes on the ridge? You said, continue part 4. ChatGPT said, here's part 4 of your cinematic, emotionally driven, voiceover-ready narrative for the story titled. A single tear traced her cheek, but the battlefield echoed with the strength she concealed. Part 4, the silence between heartbeats. Approx. 1,600-plus words. The rain had finally stopped. Dawn spilled across the shattered valley like a hesitant promise, golden light cutting through the tattered remains of smoke. The silence that followed the night's carnage felt heavier than the explosions that had shaken the ground only hours ago. It was the silence of absence, the kind where you counted who was no longer standing beside you, and the silence itself told you the names you dreaded to say aloud. Captain Elena sat at the edge of the makeshift camp, her back against a dented supply crate. Her rifle rested across her knees, but her gaze lingered on the horizon. She hadn't slept, couldn't. Her eyelids closed only to open against images of fire, blood, and the faces of the young soldiers she had led into that inferno. Some returned. Others became names carved into memory. She drew in a slow breath, her chest aching under the weight of responsibility. The dawn was beautiful, cruelly so. She had always hated that about war, the way the world outside seemed indifferent. The sun still rose, the rivers still carried on, the mountains still stood, while inside her she carried shadows. The quiet crunch of boots drew near. Lieutenant Sarah knelt down beside her, carrying 2 tin cups of black coffee. She offered one without speaking, and Elena accepted it with a nod. "You didn't sleep," Sarah murmured. "Neither did you," Elena replied, her voice low but steady. Sarah let out a dry laugh. "Guess none of us did, but the men, they look to you. They're holding it together because they think you are." Elena lifted her gaze, meeting Sarah's eyes. Behind the younger woman's composure there was a question unspoken. "Are you, really?" Elena didn't answer. She only sipped the bitter liquid, letting its warmth ground her. She had learned long ago that leadership wasn't about showing your pain. It was about transforming it into a shield for others. Even when that shield cracked, you stood, because your silence gave them the strength to move forward. Later that morning, the survivors of the night's mission gathered in what remained of the old farmhouse they had claimed as a temporary base. The roof was torn, the windows shattered, but it offered cover enough. Elena stood at the center, her hands clasped behind her back, posture erect despite the fatigue pulling at her muscles. The room was filled with faces, hollowed by exhaustion, bruised by smoke and fear. Every eye was fixed on her. "We held the line last night," she began, her voice calm, carrying authority without strain. "The enemy broke through in waves, and yet you stood, you fought. And because of that, the village behind us still breathes. Families still wake up this morning because you refuse to fall." A murmur rippled through the room. Some soldiers straightened, others lowered their heads, but Elena pressed on. "I won't lie to you. We lost good people, people whose names deserve to be remembered, not whispered in regret. And we will remember them, not as fallen, but as the ones who bought us this dawn." Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. She paced slowly, letting her boots echo against the cracked floor. "Our fight isn't over. The enemy will come again and we'll meet them again. But hear this, our strength is not in numbers, it's not in weapons, it's in the bond that ties us. When one falters, another rises. When one bleeds, another carries the weight. That is why we endure." Silence held the room when she finished. Not the silence of despair, but of something heavier, resolve. Even in their pain, they absorbed her words like fire into cold flesh. And yet when the soldiers dispersed, Elena's composure fractured. She turned toward the broken window, away from their eyes. Her hands trembled for the first time. One single tear slid down her cheek, but she quickly brushed it away before anyone could see. By afternoon, scouts returned with reports. Enemy forces regrouping, heavier units moving in their direction. It wasn't a question of if they would strike again. It was only when. Elena gathered her officers, Sarah, the grim-faced medic Corporal Reyes, and Sergeant Malik, who had fought by her side since the early campaigns. They spread a faded map across the farmhouse table, marking enemy movements with charcoal lines. "They'll hit us here," Malik said, pointing toward the valley mouth. "It's their only clear approach, but they'll come heavier this time, tanks, artillery." "We don't have the firepower to stop that," Reyes muttered, his hands stained with dried blood from treating the wounded. Elena studied the map, her eyes narrowing. "We don't stop them by matching their strength. We stop them by breaking their rhythm." Sarah leaned closer. "An ambush." Elena nodded. "We use the terrain, funnel them into the valley. Mines, choke points, snipers along the ridges. We bleed their advance before they reach us." Reyes frowned. "That means more risk, more lives on the line." Elena's gaze met his. "All war is risk, but if we hold here, if we delay them long enough, reinforcements will arrive. If we break, the villages behind us burn." The weight of her words settled over them like stone. Each officer gave a slow nod. They didn't need to agree with her fully, they only needed to believe she would not falter. And she wouldn't, not where it mattered. That night, as the soldiers prepared defenses, Elena walked the ridgeline alone. The valley stretched below her, quiet and deceptively serene under the moonlight. She traced the paths in her mind, the routes where enemy armor would roll, the choke points where she would station her teams. Her heart pounded in a rhythm that felt too loud for the still night. The silence between each beat carried voices, memories of those already lost, the cries of those who might fall tomorrow. She sank to one knee, pressing her palm into the earth. "How many more names will I carry?" The question echoed inside her, heavy and relentless. A small hand rested on her shoulder. She turned to find Sarah standing there, eyes soft but steady. "You don't have to carry this alone," Sarah whispered. Elena almost smiled, almost allowed herself to confess the weight crushing her. But she didn't. Instead, she placed her hand over Sarah's and said, "Tomorrow they'll look to you too. Be ready." Sarah's eyes glistened, but she nodded. "Always." The moment stretched, fragile but strong. Then Elena rose, her shadow cast long under the moonlight, and together they walked back toward the camp. The valley would burn again come dawn. But so long as she drew breath, so long as her strength could shield even one more life, she would stand. And though a single tear might trace her cheek in the solitude of night, the battlefield would echo not with weakness, but with the strength she concealed. Dawn was still a rumor on the horizon when Captain Elena moved through the ranks of her soldiers, her boots crunching softly against the frostbitten soil. The valley stretched below like a sleeping beast, cloaked in mist and silence. Every ridge, every shadow, every jagged rock was a place she had studied, memorized, transformed into a piece of her plan. The men and women under her command adjusted their gear with deliberate care. No chatter, no bravado, just the metallic clicks of rifles being checked, the dull thud of boots digging trenches, the steady breath of people who knew death could find them in the next few hours. Elena paused beside a squad digging in near the valley's mouth. Their faces, illuminated faintly by the last of the moonlight, were taut but disciplined. One of the younger soldiers, barely older than a boy, looked up as she passed. His lips trembled as if he wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She rested a gloved hand on his shoulder. "You'll do your part, that's all anyone can ask." The boy's throat bobbed, but he nodded firmly, clenching his rifle like it was the only anchor in the storm ahead. By the time the first pale rays stretched across the horizon, the valley was set. Mines buried beneath the soil, makeshift barricades erected, sniper nests carved into stone. Elena stood on the ridgeline with her binoculars, scanning the eastern approach. And then she saw it. Dark shapes crawling across the mist, growing larger with every passing second. The ground beneath her boots vibrated faintly. A rumble, low, steady, hungry. Enemy armor. Columns of soldiers advancing in disciplined formation behind them. "Here they come," she whispered. Her radio crackled. Sarah's voice came sharp and steady from the forward observation post. Enemy forces confirmed. Estimated battalion strength. Armor in the lead. Elena lowered the binoculars. Her jaw tightened, heavier than expected. Still, she pressed the transmitter. "All units, hold your positions. Wait for my mark." The soldiers dug in deeper. Breath slowed. Fingers curled around triggers. Every eye turned toward the valley mouth. The beast had awakened. The first tanks rolled into the valley, their treads grinding earth and stone. Soldiers marched in tight lines, their armor glinting beneath the growing light. The enemy commander must have believed the valley was theirs already, that no force could stand against such overwhelming firepower. They were wrong. Elena raised her fist high above her head. For a heartbeat the world held still. Then she dropped it. The valley erupted. Mines thundered beneath enemy treads, fire blooming into the sky. The front line convulsed as tanks shuddered and collapsed into smoke and twisted steel. Soldiers scattered, some falling, others scrambling for cover. From the ridges above, sniper fire cracked precise and deadly. Enemy troops dropped in rapid succession, confusion splintering their ranks. Machine gun nests opened fire, sweeping arcs that tore into advancing lines. The valley that had seemed silent and empty moments ago was now a furnace of sound. Explosions, screams, the rattle of gunfire. And through it all, Elena stood tall on the ridge, her voice calm over the radio. "Hold them, channel them, break them here." The enemy rallied faster than she expected. For every tank destroyed, two more pushed forward. For every line disrupted, new ranks filled the gaps. The valley shook beneath their relentless advance. Elena adjusted her binoculars, scanning the shifting tides of battle. She could almost feel the heartbeat of the enemy commander somewhere beyond her sight, matching her move for move. Left flanks folding, Rays shouted over the radio. "Reinforce with second squad," Elena barked back. "Sarah, shift your sniper fire, cover their retreat." Her commands flowed like water, each word sharp, decisive. Yet beneath the precision she felt the storm clawing at her chest. The enemy was strong, too strong. Still, she refused to yield. The fighting stretched into hours. Smoke choked the valley, sunlight fractured by haze and fire. The earth itself seemed to scream with every detonation. Soldiers on both sides fell, their voices swallowed by the relentless chaos. And then it happened. A shell exploded near the ridgeline, showering Elena's position with debris. She staggered but didn't fall, raising her radio again. But before she could issue her next command, she heard Sarah's voice, sharp with panic. "Captain, the right ridge is collapsing. They're breaking through." Elena's blood ran cold. If the enemy breached that flank, the valley's defenses would unravel. Without hesitation, she sprinted along the ridge, her boots pounding over jagged stone. Dust filled her lungs, but she pushed harder, reaching the crumbling line where a handful of soldiers were barely holding against the surge. She slid into cover beside them, rifle snapping to her shoulder. Her shots cracked out, dropping enemies one by one. The soldiers glanced at her, eyes widening, not with fear but with a surge of strength. Their captain was here. "Hold," she shouted above the roar. "You do not yield this ridge, not while I stand." Her words ignited them like flame catching dry wood. The line steadied. They fired back with renewed fury, the enemy advanced slowing under their combined will. Hours bled into a blur. Elena lost track of time, of how many times she reloaded, how many orders she screamed into the radio. She only knew the rhythm of survival, the silence between heartbeats, the trigger squeezed, the next soldier steadied. When the sun reached its zenith, the battlefield was a wasteland of smoke and fire. Both armies were bloodied, broken, but still locked in their deadly embrace. Finally, a faint tremor carried across the ridges, not from the enemy this time, from the west. Reinforcements. Elena's chest constricted with relief. Through the haze, she saw the outlines of Allied vehicles cresting the hills, fresh troops pouring into the fray. The tide began to shift. The enemy faltered, their advance stuttering under the renewed assault. And though the valley still burned, though countless lives had been lost, Elena felt a spark kindle within her chest. They had held, against everything they had held. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, the guns finally fell silent. Smoke curled lazily into the cooling air. The battlefield lay in ruin, but the enemy was retreating. Elena stood at the center of it all, her uniform torn, her face streaked with dirt and blood. She had not cried. Not yet. Her soldiers limped around her, some carrying the wounded, others standing in stunned silence at the cost of survival. Sarah approached, exhaustion written across her face. "We did it," she whispered, as if afraid to believe it. Elena's gaze swept the valley. The graves unmarked, the faces missing, the silence too heavy to celebrate. She nodded slowly. "Yes, but at a price." Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for Elena's arm. "You kept us alive. You gave us this day." For a moment, Elena let herself breathe. Let herself feel the weight she had carried for all of them. Her throat tightened, and against her will, a single tear traced her cheek. But the battlefield around her did not echo with sorrow. It echoed with survival, with strength, with the truth that even in the valley of fire, she had concealed nothing but resolve. Why did silence feel heavier than the gunfire? The valley no longer roared with tanks or rifles. It whispered now, low groans of the wounded, faint clatter of debris tumbling down rocks, the wind threading through smoke and ash. Captain Elena stood among her soldiers, boots buried ankle-deep in the churned mud of battle. The air reeked of iron, burnt oil, and something else she refused to name. They had survived, but at what cost? Her radio hung at her side, its once constant crackle replaced by static. She didn't dare turn it off. Silence meant names she hadn't yet confirmed. One of the medics moved past her, blood staining his gloves up to the elbows. He didn't look at her. He just kept running toward the next body, the next soldier clinging to life. Elena pressed her hand to her chest, where the fabric of her uniform was stiff with dried sweat and smoke. She wanted to breathe deeply but couldn't, not without inhaling the stench of loss. "Captain." Sarah's voice, fragile. Elena turned. Sarah stood a few feet away, helmet in her hands, strands of hair clinging to her dirt-smeared face. Behind her lay 3 covered bodies, shrouded in makeshift tarps. Elena didn't need to ask who they were. She already knew the outlines. Her throat constricted. "How many?" Sarah's lips trembled before the answer came. 30 confirmed, 20 missing. Elena closed her eyes. The number pressed against her like a stone slab. She could still see them, smiling around campfires, cleaning rifles in silence, writing quick letters in the dark. Faces that had marched into the valley with her, trusting her to guide them back. Faces she would now carry like shadows for the rest of her life. Duty had always weighed on her shoulders. Today, it dug into her bones. As dusk bled into night, she forced herself to walk the valley floor, not as a captain issuing commands, not as a strategist tallying positions, just as one of them, someone who owed them her presence, even in silence. She knelt beside a soldier who clutched a photograph of a little girl with missing front teeth. His hand shook as he tried to fold the picture, but his fingers wouldn't obey. Elena helped, slipping it gently into his pocket, whispering, "She's waiting for you. Hold on." She lingered by another raise, his arm bandaged, his eyes half closed. He tried to laugh when he saw her, but the sound cracked. "You don't look so good, Captain." "Neither do you," she answered softly. "But you're still here, that's enough." His gaze softened. "Still here thanks to you." The words cut deeper than any wound. She wasn't sure if he meant them as comfort or burden. Maybe both. Later, in the makeshift command tent, Elena studied the map laid across the table. Lines of ink and markers no longer felt like strategy. They felt like gravestones. Every position marked with a red X told a story of a soldier who had stood, fought, and fallen. Sarah entered quietly, setting down 2 tin cups of bitter coffee. Her eyes flicked to the map. "You're still planning." Elena's jaw tightened. "The enemy will regroup. This valley bought us time, but not safety." "Maybe," Sarah said gently, "but right now our people need something else. They need to see you breathe." Elena's hand hovered over the map, trembling before she pulled it back. She wanted to argue, wanted to claim that duty meant never stopping, never resting. But she heard her father's voice in her mind, gruff, steady, spoken years ago when she was still young enough to believe soldiers were unbreakable. "Grace isn't in how you fight, Elena. It's in how you carry the silence afterward." Her chest tightened. She reached for the coffee, the bitter taste grounding her for a moment. But there was something she hadn't told Sarah, something she hadn't told anyone. A message tucked into her pocket, delivered hours before the battle, when the enemy's advance was still a rumor. A single folded sheet of paper with her name written in hurried script. She hadn't read it until after the fighting ended. Now its words burned against her skin every time she touched her pocket. She slipped outside, away from the others, into the valley's quiet edges. The stars shimmered above, pale through the lingering haze. For a long time she just stood there, feeling the weight of the message she carried. Finally, with hands that didn't feel like her own, she unfolded it. It was from command. "Captain Elena, intelligence confirms the enemy push into your sector is not their main offensive. You are tasked with holding them as long as possible. Reinforcements will not arrive in time. Your defense is vital to the larger operation. Your sacrifice will save thousands." The word sacrifice cut deeper than any bullet. They had known. They had sent her and her soldiers here not to win, but to bleed, to hold until they could no longer stand. Her breath hitched, rage and sorrow colliding in her chest. She thought of the boy clutching the photograph, of Ray's half laughing through pain, of Sarah still believing survival meant something more than a line on a map. Did they know they were meant to be sacrificed? Did they understand the cost written between those lines? Elena crumpled the paper in her fist, tears burning hot against the dirt on her cheeks. She wanted to scream, wanted to hurl it into the fire, but instead she folded it again, tucking it back into her pocket. They didn't need to know, not now. Duty wasn't just about orders. Sometimes it was about shielding those you loved from the truth. By midnight the camp had quieted. The wounded slept fitfully. Those still able kept watch in shifts, rifles across their knees, eyes hollow but steady. Elena sat alone near the ridgeline, staring into the dark expanse beyond. Somewhere out there, the enemy was regrouping. Somewhere out there, fresh waves of steel and fire prepared to descend again. And yet, for the first time since the battle began, she allowed herself to feel, not as a captain, not as a soldier, but as a woman who had carried too much for too long. Her thoughts drifted to her brother, the one she had buried years ago in another war, another valley. He had been younger, braver in ways she could never explain. She remembered his laughter, his reckless grin, the way he had written to her. "Don't let them break you, Elena. Promise me that." She had promised, and she had kept that promise, though tonight the cracks ran deep. Sarah joined her quietly, lowering herself to the ground beside her. For a while, they said nothing, just listened to the wind sweeping the valley. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you reading something earlier, from command." Elena hesitated, her fingers brushing her pocket. She thought about telling her, thought about unburdening the truth. But when she met Sarah's tired eyes, all she said was, "It doesn't change what we have to do." Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You always carry more than us. I don't know how you do it." Elena's gaze drifted back to the horizon, where faint lights flickered like watchful eyes. "Grace," she murmured, more to herself than to Sarah. "My father always said grace is what keeps you from drowning in the weight." They sat together in silence, the storm gathering unseen in the distance. Tomorrow would bring more fire, more loss. Elena knew it as surely as she knew her own heartbeat. But tonight she let the silence hold her. Because even in silence, she was still carrying them all, with pride, with pain, with the unbroken strength of someone who refused to let duty crush the last of her humanity. Why did the night feel too still? Captain Elena woke to the sound of nothing, the kind of silence that didn't soothe but suffocated. She sat up in her cot inside the command tent, boots already laced, rifle never far. The air pressed thick against her chest, damp with smoke that hadn't fully lifted. Even the wounded seemed to stir less, their breathing faint, the camp blanketed by a fragile, uneasy calm. And that's when she felt it. The ground, the faintest tremor, then another, like distant thunder too steady to be storm clouds. She froze, breath caught, hand tightening around the edge of her cot. The storm wasn't gone, it was only waiting. By dawn, the horizon bled with fire. The enemy was returning, stronger, heavier, angrier. Columns of armor rolled forward, artillery booming in the distance, their shells arching high before crashing into the valley with deafening force. The earth convulsed, soldiers scrambled for cover. The wounded cried out as dust rained from torn canvas shelters. Elena pushed through it all, shouting orders into her radio. "Positions, dig in deeper. They'll try to crush us fast, make them bleed for every inch." Ray's stumbled up beside her, arms still bandaged, face pale. "Captain, we don't have the strength for this. Half of us can't even fire straight." His voice cracked, not in defiance but in fear. The kind that grips a man who knows his body can't match his will. Elena met his eyes. "Then we hold with what we have. No one breaks, not now." She didn't tell him the truth. That command had never expected them to last this long. That every hour they still stood was more than anyone had asked for. Because if she did, she feared the valley would collapse from the inside before the enemy even touched them. The bombardment stretched into hours. Every blast rattled teeth, shook loose stones, shredded nerves. Elena crouched beside Sarah in the forward trench, mud splattering across their faces as another shell landed too close. Sarah reloaded her rifle with shaking hands. "How much longer do you think we can?" She didn't finish. The words broke under the thunder of an explosion that swallowed half the trench 20 meters down. Screams cut the air, then fell into silence. Elena's gut twisted, but she shouted anyway. "Hold the line, return fire." They fired back, rifles, mortars, every weapon they still had breath to carry. Smoke and chaos blurred the battlefield into a nightmare of shadow and fire. But the enemy kept coming. Like a tide that refused to ebb, They surged forward, filling the valley with their numbers. At midday, when the smoke briefly cleared, Elena saw it, enemy banners pushing deeper into the valley. Their commander was no longer cautious. He was confident, convinced this time the defenders would crumble. Her radio hissed. "Raise again," his voice ragged. "They're breaking through Sector 3, we can't stop them." Elena clenched her jaw, pressing the transmitter. "Fall back to the secondary ridge. We're not done yet." She cut the line before he could answer, not because she didn't want to hear him, but because she couldn't bear the weight of his voice breaking. The secondary ridge was smaller, narrower, but it gave them height. Elena rallied whoever was left, dragging them into position. Mud streaked across their faces, uniforms torn, hands raw from digging and firing. When Sarah crouched beside her, gasping for breath, Elena caught the look in her eyes. Not just exhaustion, not just fear, something else. "You're hiding something," Sarah said suddenly, her words sharp as a blade. Elena froze. "What are you talking about?" "I saw the paper," Sarah whispered, anger trembling beneath her fatigue. "The one you folded and hid. I know what it means. We weren't sent here to win. We were sent here to die." The words hit harder than any shell. For a heartbeat, Elena said nothing. The weight she'd carried alone now pressed against her in the open air. Sarah's breath shook. "Why didn't you tell us?" Elena turned away, staring down the valley where enemy armor clawed closer. Smoke stung her eyes, but her voice was steady. "Because you needed to believe this was survival, not sacrifice. If I told you the truth, would you have fought this hard?" Sarah swallowed, tears mixing with dirt on her cheeks. "We fight for you, Elena, not for them, not for their orders." The words lodged deep in Elena's chest. For a moment, she almost let herself collapse under their weight. But another explosion shook the ridge, forcing her back to her feet. She couldn't break, not now, not with them watching. The enemy's second wave crashed into them like a hammer. Bullets sparked against stone. Grenades detonated in shallow craters. Men and women screamed as they fell. Elena fired until her rifle clicked empty, then reloaded with trembling fingers. She barked orders, dragged wounded to cover, shoved fresh magazines into the hands of those too numb to move. Everywhere she turned, she saw faces breaking, not from lack of courage, but from the cruel knowledge that courage wasn't enough. Still they fought, still they held. Not for orders, not for command, but for each other. By late afternoon, the ridge was a ruin of shattered rock and broken bodies. The enemy had slowed, but not stopped. Elena leaned against the remains of a barricade, her breathing ragged. Ray's limped toward her, blood soaking through his bandages. He collapsed to one knee. "Captain, if they come again, we won't stand." His eyes were wide, not pleading, not accusing, just searching, searching for an answer only she could give. Elena knelt beside him, resting a hand against his shoulder. "Then we give them something they'll never forget. Even if we fall, they'll know we stood." Her words weren't strategy, they weren't hope, they were truth. Ray's nodded weakly, gripping his rifle once more. Night fell heavy and fast, the valley lit only by the flicker of fires. The enemy had withdrawn for now, regrouping for the next strike. Elena knew it was coming. The final push. The storm that would either bury them or break the invaders. She stood at the ridge's edge, the wind tugging at her torn uniform, smoke swirling around her like a shroud. Behind her, Sarah approached, silent for a moment before speaking. "When they come again, I'll be beside you, always." Elena turned her head, meeting her gaze. Dirt and tears streaked Sarah's face, but her eyes burned steady. Elena wanted to speak, to tell her everything she had carried, everything she had lost, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she whispered, "Then let's make sure they remember us." The valley below was dark, but she could feel it. The storm massing, armor engines growling in the distance. Tomorrow would bring the end, one way or another. And Elena, though her body trembled, stood unbroken. Because sometimes duty didn't mean surviving. Sometimes it meant carrying the weight of silence, of sacrifice, of truth, until the very last breath. And she was ready. She never expected the silence to be so loud. The rotors had stopped hours ago. The radios were quiet. No one barked orders, no one called for her. Just the low hum of the wind brushing across the hills. Her boots were planted firmly in the soil, her rifle resting across her lap, and the weight of the mission, of everything that had been lost, rested heavier than the weapon itself. Had she done enough? That question pulsed through her veins, louder than any explosion she had ever heard. Her squad was gone, scattered across memory and earth. Their voices lingered in fragments. James laughing under the rain, Morale sketching home in the margins of his notebook, Lee whispering prayers no one else ever heard. Now, all those fragments belonged only to her. She had carried them through the storm, through fire and blood and silence, and she would carry them still. The extraction zone was behind her now. She could have walked away. She could have taken the seat on the last bird out. But instead she stayed, alone, watching the horizon, not as a soldier waiting for an enemy but as a witness, to make sure their story was not erased. Her hands shook once, just once. She closed them into fists, grounding herself in the present. There was no one to see her weakness, but she would not let it linger. Weakness had no place here. And yet in that private space where no orders reached, she allowed herself one truth. She missed them. More than duty, more than pride, she missed them as people, as family. That was the storm no training could ever prepare her for. The wind carried a sound then, a faint metallic clink. Her instincts sharpened instantly. But it wasn't a weapon. It was her own dog tag slipping from under her collar. She caught it, staring at the name etched into the thin metal. And she thought of her father's words, "Duty isn't about weight. It's about what you're willing to carry without complaint." She finally understood. It wasn't the rifle, or the armor, or the mission reports. It was them, the ones who couldn't walk any further. She carried them step by step. Her radio crackled once, static, no words. She didn't answer. She simply turned the volume down, letting the silence return. In the fading light she stood, not to fight, not to run, simply to stand straight-backed, her shadow stretching long across the battlefield. It was a gesture no one would see, but perhaps that was the point. Grace didn't need an audience. Pride didn't need applause. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And so she stood there, a lone figure against the horizon, the storm behind her, the unknown ahead. Unbroken, unyielding, carrying it all with a quiet strength that no bullet, no loss, no silence could ever take away. That was her ending and her beginning.